49,000. Hold on to that number because by the end of this video, it is going to mean something very different than it does right now. 49,000 is how many Chinese-built electric cars Canada has just agreed to let in, at a tariff of 6%. 12 months ago, that tariff was 100%. 100. A wall built so high it was designed to keep every single one of those cars out of the country. And then, in the space of one handshake in Beijing, that wall came down. Not lowered, not trimmed, torn open. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Canada did not open that door to get cars. It opened it to sell seeds. Canola for sedans. Farms traded for factory floors. While Mexico was slamming its border shut with tariffs of up to 50% and Washington kept its own wall standing at 100, Canada quietly became the one crack in North America's armor. The only one. So how does a G7 nation, a country that still builds over 1 million vehicles a year, end up signing its own car market over to Beijing? Stick with me, because this was not an accident. It was not bad luck. It was a signature. The country that built Detroit's shadow. To understand what Canada just gave away, you first have to understand what Canada used to be, because here is something most people, including most Canadians, have quietly forgotten. Canada is not just a place that buys cars. Canada builds them. It has built them for more than a century, and for a long stretch of that century, it built them better and in greater numbers than almost anyone alive today realizes. Stand on the riverfront in Windsor, Ontario, and you can see Detroit across the water. Close enough to read the buildings, and for 100 years, the two cities were not rivals. They were one machine split by a border. Ford set up shop on the Canadian side all the way back in 1904, in a little community called Walkerville, before most people on Earth had ever seen an automobile. General Motors grew out of a Canadian carriage maker in Oshawa, a company that was stitching together buggies before the First World War. Oshawa did not just have a car plant. Oshawa was a car plant with a city attached. Then, in 1965, came the deal that changed everything. The Auto Pact, signed between Lester Pearson and Lyndon Johnson, effectively erased the border for the car industry. Parts flowed one way, finished vehicles flowed the other, and southern Ontario transformed into one of the great manufacturing corridors on the planet. Oakville building Fords, Brampton building Chryslers, Honda arriving in Alliston in 1986, Toyota in Cambridge 2 years later. Engine plants, stamping plants, parts makers by the hundreds threaded along Highway 401 like beads on a wire. And it worked. My word, did it work? By 1999, this country of barely 30 million people was producing around 3 million vehicles a year, enough to put it among the top 5 car-making nations on Earth. Ahead of Britain, ahead of Italy, ahead of nearly everyone. The industry came to employ well over 100,000 people directly. And once you counted the tool shops, the seat makers, the wiring firms, the truckers hauling parts across the Ambassador Bridge every single night, the number climbed toward 500,000 livelihoods. Roughly 9 out of every 10 vehicles rolling off Canadian lines were shipped straight south to American driveways. It was steady, it was skilled. It was the kind of work that bought houses and put kids through college in towns like Oshawa, Windsor, Brampton, and St. Thomas. It was, in every sense that matters, a pillar, which is exactly why what happened next was so easy to miss. Because pillars do not usually fall over. They erode, quietly, from the inside. And by the time anyone thinks to check, you are not looking at a pillar anymore. You are looking at a shell, the quiet unraveling. The first tremor that most people actually felt came in November 2018, when General Motors announced it was ending vehicle assembly in Oshawa. Oshawa, the town where GM Canada was born, a place that had been building cars for over 100 years. When the last car rolled off that line in December 2019, thousands of assembly jobs went with it, and a community built around a single company for 4 generations watched its reason for existing get boxed up and shipped out. The plant later reopened in reduced form to build pickup trucks, and that mattered. But nobody in Oshawa pretends it is what it was. That was the warning shot. What came after was the barrage. Canada, like Britain, like everyone, had bet its automotive future on electric. Ottawa and Ontario threw billions in incentives at the transition, and for a moment, it looked like the bet was landing. Honda announced a $15 billion electric vehicle and battery project anchored in Alliston, the largest auto investment in Canadian history. Volkswagen committed to a gigafactory in St. Thomas. Stellantis and LG broke ground on a battery plant in Windsor. On paper, Canada was about to leap a generation. Then the paper started to burn. In the spring of 2025, Honda quietly postponed that $15 billion project by roughly 2 years, citing a cooling EV market. Around the same time, Northvolt, the Swedish battery champion that was supposed to build a $7 billion gigafactory on Montreal's South Shore, collapsed into bankruptcy before producing a single Canadian cell, taking hundreds of millions in public money and an entire provincial strategy down with it. If you watched what happened to Britain's battery dream, this will sound painfully familiar. Different flag, same funeral. And then Washington twisted the knife. New American tariffs on imported vehicles landed in 2025 like a tax stamped on the roof of every car leaving Ontario. And remember, America is where 9 out of 10 of those cars go. Stellantis responded by pulling the next generation Jeep Compass out of Brampton entirely and moving it to Illinois, leaving one of Canada's flagship plants sitting idle while a town of workers waited for news that kept not coming. Meanwhile, at home, the electric transition was stalling in the driveway. The federal purchase rebate ran out of money in early 2025, and EV sales promptly sagged. So badly that by September, the government suspended its own 2026 sales mandate because the target had drifted out of reach. Think about that sequence. Canada ordered its industry to go electric, watched the buyers hesitate, then quietly deleted the order. Add it all up, and the numbers tell the story with brutal simplicity. A country that built around 3 million vehicles at its peak now builds somewhere in the region of 1.3 million. Less than half. Plant by plant, project by project, the pillar was hollowing out. And each time a piece fell, it got a headline, a day of local heartbreak, and a national shrug. Sound familiar? It should. But here is where Canada's story stops rhyming with anyone else's and becomes something stranger. Because into this weakened, wounded, distracted industry walked the biggest car-making power the world has ever seen, and Canada's first instinct was to build a wall. The wall. In August 2024, Ottawa made a decision that looked, at the time, like strength. It announced a 100% surtax on Chinese-made electric vehicles, effective that October, deliberately matching the United States almost move for move. The reasoning was blunt and frankly hard to argue with. Beijing had spent nearly 2 decades and by some estimates more than $200 billion American dollars subsidizing its electric vehicle industry into a giant, and that giant was now producing far more cars than China could ever absorb at home. The surplus had to go somewhere. Europe was already flooded. Ottawa looked at the tidal wave and decided Canada would not be next. 100%. Double the price of every Chinese-built EV at the border. A wall so tall, it was less a tariff than a locked door. But here is the twist buried inside that story, the part almost nobody clocked at the time. China was already in the country, not sneaking in, pouring in, through the front door, wearing a badge everyone trusted. Tesla. In 2023, the last full year before the wall went up, Tesla shipped more than 44,000 vehicles into Canada from its gigafactory in Shanghai. The company had even configured that factory to build a Canada-specific Model Y, and the result was a 460% surge in China-built cars flowing through the Port of Vancouver in a single year. Read that again. Before a single BYD showroom existed on Canadian soil, tens of thousands of Chinese-built cars were already parked in Canadian driveways, and their owners mostly had no idea. So the wall went up. Tesla rerouted its supply from the United States and Germany. The Chinese brands stayed out. And for about 15 months, the fortress held. Then Beijing did something the fortress was never designed for. It did not attack the wall. It walked around it, out into the wheat fields, and squeezed. The canola trap. To understand what happened next, you need to know one thing about Canada that has absolutely nothing to do with cars. Canada is a farming superpower, and the crown jewel of Canadian agriculture is a bright yellow crop called canola. Drive across Saskatchewan in July and it stretches to the horizon in every direction, a carpet of gold. Canola is worth tens of billions of dollars a year to the Canadian economy. It supports a couple 100,000 jobs. And for years, its single biggest customer, the market that made whole prairie towns viable, was China. Beijing knew this. Beijing had always known this. So in March 2025, in retaliation for the EV tariffs, China hit back, not at Ontario's car plants, at the Prairies. 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil and canola meal, 100% on peas, 25% on pork and seafood. Then, in August, it went further, slapping an anti-dumping duty on canola seed itself that pushed the combined rate to roughly 84%. Almost overnight, a multi-billion-dollar export pipeline slammed shut. And suddenly, the pain of a trade war that began in Ontario's factories was being felt hardest 2,000 kilometers away in farm kitchens in Saskatchewan and Manitoba by families who had never built a car in their lives. Here is the cold genius of it. China did not attack Canada's auto industry at all. It took Canada's farmers hostage and then it named the ransom. And the ransom was the showroom. Because think about the position this put Ottawa in. On one side, an auto sector already bleeding from American tariffs, stalled EV projects, and a dead battery dream. On the other, a farm economy watching its biggest customer vanish, with rural communities and billions in exports twisting in the wind. Two of the country's great industries, and a trade wall that could only protect one of them at the direct expense of the other. Something had to give. And in January 2026, something did. Quick pause before we get to the handshake that changed everything. If this story is landing the way it landed on me when I first pieced it together, do me a favor and hit like and subscribe. Because the numbers you are about to hear were published in plain sight in official government documents, and almost nobody has stitched them together into the story they actually tell, right? Beijing, the Great Hall of the People. Let's go. One handshake in Beijing, January 16th, 2026. Prime Minister Mark Carney stands in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, shaking hands with Xi Jinping. It is the kind of image Canadian leaders had avoided for nearly a decade through spy scandals, hostage diplomacy, and some of the frostiest relations in the two countries' history. And out of 2 days of meetings comes a deal that quietly rewrites the rules of the North American car market. Here is what Canada agreed to. The 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, gone. In its place, a tariff of just 6.1% on a quota of 49,000 Chinese-built EVs in the first year. And that quota is not fixed. It grows every single year, climbing to 70,000 vehicles by 2030. Even more telling is what is inside the quota. A rising share of it, reaching fully half by the end of the decade, is reserved specifically for affordable EVs priced under 35,000 Canadian dollars. In other words, the deal was engineered on purpose to bring cheap Chinese cars to ordinary Canadian buyers. Ottawa even committed to working with Chinese manufacturers on speedy safety certification to get them on the road faster. And what did Canada get in return? Exactly what you think. China agreed to slash its canola seed tariffs from roughly 84% down to about 15%. Canadian canola meal, lobster, crab, and peas were spared from retaliation. Exports of beef and pet food would resume. Billions of dollars in agricultural trade switched back on. Beijing even promised what Carney described as considerable investment in Canada's auto sector over the coming 3 years. Hold on to that phrase. We are coming back to it. Now, if you are wondering whether anyone in Canada's own car industry believed this was a good deal for cars, listen to the head of the country's Auto Parts Association, one of the industry's most prominent voices. His assessment, almost word for word, was that the Prime Minister did not make this deal because he thought it was a good automotive deal. He made it because it was required to balance Canada's other interests. Sit with that for a second. The people who speak for the industry are openly saying the industry was the price, not the prize. The price. Farms were saved, fishermen were saved, and the door to the Canadian car market, a door Ottawa itself had bolted shut barely a year earlier while warning about a subsidized tidal wave, was propped open with a signed invitation taped to the frame. The wall did not fall. That is the thing to understand. The wall was traded. The flood finds the crack. So what actually happens when you cut a tariff from 100% to 6%? You find out very quickly who was waiting outside the door. On March 1st, 2026, Ottawa began processing import permits, with the first tranche of 24,500 quota slots handed out on a first-come, first-served basis. And the early winners tell you everything about how this game really works. Tesla, with its Shanghai Gigafactory already tooled for Canadian-spec vehicles, could simply flip the tap back on. Volvo and Polestar, both controlled by China's Geely, had paused imports of their Chinese-built models when the wall went up in 2024. The New Deal made those cars profitable again overnight. Even Lotus, the storied British sports car brand now majority-owned by Geely, announced that the price of its Wuhan-built Elantra SUV, previously sitting at a jaw-dropping 313,000 Canadian dollars, would fall by roughly half, from one signature. And behind them, the main event, BYD, Chery, and Geely's own brands, with first deliveries to Canadian buyers expected in the final months of 2026. The car makers that turned Europe's market upside down, the ones offering vehicles packed with screens, software, and range at prices Western manufacturers privately admit they cannot match. The incumbents saw it coming, and you can already watch them flinch. In the months before the first Chinese deliveries, entry-level EV prices in Canada cracked below $30,000 for the first time ever, as established brands stacked their own discounts on top of a revived federal rebate to dig a moat before the siege arrives. General Motors throwing thousands of dollars at the bolt. Toyota, Kia, Subaru, all suddenly discovering room in the price. Funny how competition works, even before it lands. And do not let anyone tell you the Chinese brands will be scared off by that 6% tariff or the quota caps. We already know how they behave under pressure, because we watched it. Even when tariffs elsewhere doubled their costs, Chinese manufacturers absorbed enormous chunks of it themselves, keeping prices low, sacrificing margin for market share, because they are not playing for this quarter's profits. They are playing for the next decade's drivers. Canada, with 2 million new vehicle sales a year, an EV mandate waiting to be revived, and a public hungry for anything affordable, is precisely the kind of beachhead worth losing money on. Now, the government will tell you correctly that 49,000 cars is small, less than 3% of the Canadian market. And that is true this year. But quotas in trade deals behave like water levels, not fences. This one is contractually scheduled to rise every year through 2030. And once tens of thousands of Canadian families are driving Chinese EVs they love, at prices no one else will match, find me the politician willing to stand up and take those cars away. Doors like this open. They do not close. Why the old guard cannot win this on price. And this is the part that the comfortable people in the industry still do not want to say out loud. The reason those Chinese cars are so dangerous is not that they are cheap junk flooding in on subsidies. It is that they are good, genuinely, frighteningly good. And they are good in exactly the areas where the next generation of buyers has decided the whole game is played. Start with the battery, because everything starts with the battery. It is the single most expensive component in an electric car, in some models close to half the cost of the entire vehicle. And China, after nearly 2 decades and an estimated $230 billion American dollars of state support, does not just lead in batteries. It dominates them, from the mines to the chemistry labs to the factory floor. When BYD announces a battery that can add 400 kilometers of range in 5 minutes, and CATL answers with 520, those are not press releases. Those are warning shots aimed at every legacy manufacturer on the planet. And look at how the Western giants are responding, because it tells you who is really holding the cards now. Ford is not out-inventing Chinese battery technology. Ford is licensing it from CATL for its new plant in Michigan. General Motors is not waiting for its own cells. It is buying them directly from CATL while its Tennessee facility gets ready. The companies that taught the world how to build cars are now paying the student for the homework. In Canada, the great hope is the Volkswagen PowerCo Gigafactory rising in St. Thomas, Ontario, a genuinely massive project and a real reason for optimism. But it is one plant, coming online years after China built hundreds. Then there is the software. Talk to buyers under 40, and you will hear it again and again. The screen is the car. The over-the-air updates, the voice assistant, the phone integration, the driving aids. Chinese EVs are built like consumer electronics, refreshed and improved at the pace of a smartphone, because that is the industry they grew out of. A century of heritage, of V8 rumble and racing pedigree means almost nothing to a customer comparing touchscreens in a showroom. Whatever Detroit and its Canadian cousins were brilliant at, and they were brilliant, that is simply not the contest anymore. So when those first BYDs and Cheris roll off ships in Vancouver late this year, priced under $35,000, loaded with technology the incumbents charge $50,000 for, understand what Canadian manufacturers are actually up against, not a rival company. An entire industrial system, decades in the making, that can lose money in Canada for years without blinking. You cannot out-discount that. You can only hope to hold the line while you rebuild. And Canada, as we have seen, has spent the last few years watching its rebuild collapse one project at a time. That is the market China is walking into, weakened at home, squeezed from the south, and hungry for exactly what Beijing is selling. Squeezed between two giants. Here is where the story stops being about cars and starts being about geography. Because Canada did not make this deal in a vacuum. It made it while sitting directly on top of the most protectionist auto market on Earth. Look at the map of North America at the start of 2026, and the picture is almost absurd. The United States tariff wall at 100% plus, Chinese EVs effectively banned. Mexico, which spent years as China's friendly gateway into the hemisphere, reversing course hard and imposing tariffs of up to 50% on Chinese cars, and parts from January 1st to protect its own factories. And then Canada, 6.1%. A continent bolted shut with one door swinging open at the top. Washington noticed. Of course Washington noticed. American officials have been pushing for the 3 USMCA countries to align their external tariffs precisely so that China cannot slip into the North American market through a side entrance. And Canada just became the side entrance. The tension broke into the open in the most 21st century way imaginable, at the G7 summit in Evian, when a live microphone caught Carney explaining the deal directly to Donald Trump. You could hear him working to shrink it in real time. Less than 3% of our market, 49,000 cars. A prime minister caught on a hot mic, reassuring the American president that the crack in the wall is only a small crack. Honestly, you could not write it. But the squeeze does not stop at trade. There is a quieter worry riding along inside every one of those vehicles, and it is the reason Canada's industry minister is now scrambling to build an entirely new regulatory framework. Modern Chinese EVs are not machines with a bit of software sprinkled on top. They are computers with wheels, cameras, microphones, GPS trails, driver behavior, all of it collected, much of it processed by companies answerable to Beijing. Ottawa has openly cited surveillance risks tied to Chinese-built connected vehicles. Think about the strangeness of that position. A government simultaneously fast-tracking these cars into the country and drafting emergency rules about what the cars might be watching once they arrive. So picture the vice from Canada's side of the table. Tighten relations with Washington and the Prairies lose China, their lifeline market, all over again. Lean toward Beijing, and you provoke the neighbor who buys 3/4 of everything Canada sells and hosts the supply chains that keep Ontario's remaining plants alive. Every millimeter of movement in either direction costs something, and a country that once had the luxury of never choosing is now being forced to choose in public over and over, with the whole world watching the hot mics. The rival becomes the landlord. And now we arrive at the twist, the detail in this entire story that tells you more than every statistic combined. In June 2026, Canada's industry minister flew to China, not to renegotiate, not to complain, to court. She sat down face-to-face with 4 Chinese automotive companies: BYD, Chery, Geely, Shanghai Launch Automotive Technology. The purpose of those meetings was to attract Chinese investment into Canada's auto sector, and according to the minister herself, all four companies are willing to explore joint ventures to manufacture vehicles on Canadian soil. Read that twice, slowly. The country that 18 months ago built a 100% wall to keep Chinese cars out is now personally inviting Chinese car makers in to build inside the walls. The same industry, Ottawa, once accused of trying to swamp the Canadian market, may end up being the thing that fills Canada's half-empty factories. There are conditions, and to be fair, they are serious ones. Any venture must be majority Canadian-owned. It must follow Canadian labor standards. The vehicles must use Canadian parts. The software must be secure and protect users' data. Ottawa is not handing over the keys blindfolded, but step back and look at the shape of it. Brampton. Idle since the Jeep Compass left for Illinois. Oshawa, a shadow of the giant it was, a battery strategy in ruins from Montreal to Alliston. And the most realistic plan on the table for putting Canadians back on those production lines involves Chinese blueprints, Chinese battery chemistry, and Chinese capital. It is already happening elsewhere. Chery is partnering with Nissan in a deal that could see EVs built in Britain. The pattern is spreading through the entire Western world, and Canada is now openly negotiating its place in it. The rival did not just get a foothold in the market. The rival is being asked to become the landlord. And if that single fact does not capture how completely the balance of power in the car world has flipped, nothing will. The choice and the silence. Now, before you decide this is a simple story of surrender, let me be honest with you, because the truth is more uncomfortable than that. There is a real defensible case for what Canada did. Ask a canola farmer in Saskatchewan whether the deal was worth it, and you will get a very short answer. Billions in agricultural exports are flowing again. Families who spent a year staring at ruin can breathe. And for ordinary Canadian car buyers priced out of the EV transition for years, the arrival of well-built electric cars under $35,000 is not a threat. It is the first genuinely good news in a long time. Cheaper Chinese entrants are already forcing Tesla, GM, and everyone else to cut prices, which could restart Canada's stalled electric transition without Ottawa spending a single new subsidy dollar. 49,000 cars really is less than 3% of the market. Nobody serious is writing the obituary of Canadian car making today, but read the fine print, and every reassurance comes with a clock attached. The quota rises every year by design. The joint ventures, if they come, will wire Chinese technology into the foundations of whatever Canadian manufacturing survives. The Americans get their say soon, with the USMCA review looming and Washington already furious about the side door. And the entire arrangement rests on the goodwill of a partner who has now demonstrated in broad daylight exactly how the game works. Squeeze the farmers, win the showrooms. What gets squeezed next time? And what will it buy? Here's what should genuinely stay with you, though. None of this was hidden. The tariff numbers, the quota schedule, the canola trade-off, the hot mic, the meetings in Beijing, all of it sits in official releases and public records that anyone can read. And yet, stop 100 people on a street in Toronto or Calgary and ask them what Canada traded for canola access, and you will be lucky to find 5 who know. A country is changing what it is in real time, in plain sight, and the national conversation has barely cleared its throat. And do not let anyone tell you the stakes here are abstract, some economist's argument about trade balances and market share. Walk down a street in Windsor or Oshawa, and the stakes have faces. The automotive industry still underpins well over 100,000 direct jobs in this country, and hundreds of thousands more once you follow the supply chain down through the tool and die shops, the parts makers, the logistics firms, the diners across the road from the plant gates. These are some of the last jobs in Canada where a person without a university degree can earn a wage that buys a house, raises a family, and builds a town. When a plant goes quiet, it is not a line on a spreadsheet, it is mortgages. It is apprenticeships that never start. It is a community slowly discovering that its reason for existing has been outsourced. Canada has already watched that movie play out in Oshawa once. The question now is whether the country is willing to watch the sequel in slow motion, while telling itself that at least the cars got cheaper. So here is the question this whole story has been building toward. What does Canada actually want to be? A nation that builds cars, with everything that means, the skills, the towns, the ladder of good work outside the big cities? Or a nation that takes delivery of them from a superpower that plays trade the way grandmasters play chess? 3 moves ahead and perfectly patient. Because right now, more by pressure than by plan, it is drifting toward the second. And a choice made by drift is still a choice. Markets are not usually conquered. They are signed away one quiet handshake at a time. And in Ottawa, the ink is already dry.